It is, there's an apostrophe after the O.
I knew that.
And Barack.
The day Hollywood fell silent, September 26, 2008. The world was holding its breath. The global economy was trembling on the edge of collapse. Barack Obama and John McCain were locked in a fierce battle for the White House. Social media was quietly beginning to reshape how people lived, spoke, and remembered. But far away from headlines and flashing screens, in a quiet corner of Westport, Connecticut, something far more profound was happening. Hollywood was losing one of its last true giants. Paul Newman had taken his final breath. The blue-eyed icon, the symbol of class, rebellion, and quiet strength, gone. With his passing, an entire era seemed to close its eyes for the last time. This wasn't just the death of a movie star, it was the end of a standard Hollywood no longer makes. But here's the truth most people never realized. Paul Newman was never just an actor. He was a man layered with contradictions, a rebel who valued discipline, a superstar who hated fame, a heartthrob who chose loyalty over temptation, a public legend who protected his private world at all costs. And behind that carefully guarded world stood one woman, Joanne Woodward. For 50 years, she was more than his wife. She was his anchor, his shield, the keeper of stories the world was never meant to hear. For 15 long years after his death, she remained silent. The rumors grew louder. The myths became larger than the man himself. Fans wondered what was real and what was carefully polished illusion. Now at last, Joanne Woodward is opening the door. And what she reveals doesn't just add details to Paul Newman's life. It changes how we see him entirely. Because behind the flawless image, behind the awards, the activism, the fame, and the fortune, there was tragedy, there was guilt. There were moments that broke him in ways the cameras never captured. This is not the story of a perfect legend. This is the story of a man who carried greatness and heartbreak in equal measure, and of the woman who stood beside him when the world finally stopped watching, built before Hollywood ever noticed. Long before the blue eyes became a symbol of Hollywood royalty, before the awards, the power, and the myth, Paul Newman was just a boy trying to understand his place in the world. He was born on January 26, 1925, in Shaker Heights, Ohio. A quiet suburb, a disciplined household, a childhood shaped by balance. His father was Jewish, his mother was Christian. That mix mattered. It taught him tolerance early. It taught him to see life through more than one lens. And most importantly, it taught him that character mattered more than applause. Newman didn't grow up dreaming of fame. He grew up learning responsibility. When World War II arrived, he answered the call, serving in the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. Those years didn't make him famous, but they made him steady, focused, grounded. After the war, he didn't rush toward Hollywood like so many others. He prepared. He studied at Kenyon College, then sharpened his craft at the Yale School of Drama, and finally he stepped into the legendary Actors Studio in New York. This was where the transformation began. While others chased attention, Newman chased truth. He dissected emotion. He questioned every line, every movement, every silence. Acting wasn't performance to him, it was excavation. His breakthrough came in 1956 with Somebody Up There Likes Me. Playing boxer Rocky Graziano, Newman didn't just portray struggle, he embodied it. The film exploded, critics took notice, audiences locked in. Overnight, Hollywood saw a new leading man. But behind the rising star, something darker was forming. Because with fame came pressure, with opportunity came temptation, and with ambition came choices that would ripple through every corner of his personal life. Studios wanted more, bigger films, bigger budgets, bigger control. And Paul Newman, the man who valued discipline and depth, suddenly found himself trapped inside an industry that demanded a spectacle over soul. This tension didn't explode on red carpets. It grew quietly, behind closed doors, inside the relationships that mattered most. And the standing at the center of this growing storm was a woman who would soon change everything. Joanne Woodward was never just his wife. For most of the world, Joanne Woodward was seen as the quiet woman standing beside the famous man. But that narrative was always too small, because Joanne wasn't a background character in Paul Newman's story. She was a star in her own right, a heavyweight actress, a woman with talent sharp enough to cut through Hollywood's noise, and someone who deliberately chose mystery over publicity. When people ask, who was Joanne Woodward? The real answer is simple. She was the one person on earth who truly knew Paul Newman when the cameras were off, when the smiles were gone, when the legend was just a human being trying to hold himself together. They first crossed paths in 1953 during the Broadway production of Picnic. And from the beginning, something is sparked. Not the kind of chemistry that fades when the set closes, the kind of connection that quietly rewires your life. But there was a complication nobody could ignore. At that time, Paul Newman was still married to his first wife, Jackie Witt. And that fact mattered, because it meant this wasn't a clean love story. It was a love story born in tension, in longing, in a moment where the heart moved faster than the right thing to do. When his divorce was finalized, Newman and Woodward didn't waste time pretending they hadn't already found each other. They married on January 29th, 1958. And what began that day wasn't just a marriage. It became one of Hollywood's longest-lasting partnerships, built on deep respect, passion, and a bond that refused to collapse under fame. Newman once joked a line that became legendary. "I have steak at home. Why go out for hamburger?" People laughed, but behind the joke was a truth. He was loyal, not just in words, but in how he lived, how he returned home, how he stayed rooted. And Joanne, she didn't just accept his love, she matched him. In 1957, she won the Academy Award for The Three Faces of Eve. She didn't ride Paul's fame. Her talent stood on its own. Together, they became more than a power couple. They became a creative force. They shared the screen in films like The Long Hot Summer and Mr. and Mrs. Bridge. And every scene they played together carried something you can't fake. Real connection, real respect, real partnership. But what made their marriage truly rare wasn't the glamour, it was how they protected their world. They didn't raise their family under the blinding lights of Los Angeles. Instead, they built a life in Westport, Connecticut, away from Hollywood chaos, away from constant gossip, away from the pressure that destroys most celebrity homes. They wanted their children to be children. And Paul Newman, despite his nonstop life, filming, racing, business, fought for balance. He had 6 children in total, 3 from his first marriage, Scott, Susan, and Stephanie, and 3 with Joanne, Eleanor, Melissa, and Claire. Family wasn't a side chapter for him. It was the core. He brought his kids to sets, included them in projects, pulled them into the orbit of his charity work. He didn't want them to just witness his success. He wanted them to understand responsibility. But here's where the story stops being warm, because behind the image of the perfect father and husband, something was coming, something devastating, a loss so brutal it would change him forever. And it would be the tragedy that Joanne Woodward carried in silence for years, but the loss he never truly recovered from. From the outside, Paul Newman looked untouchable, a Hollywood king, a man with perfect roles, perfect timing, perfect charm. A marriage that seemed to defy every ugly stereotype the industry was known for. But inside his home, inside the life he protected more fiercely than any film role, a storm was building. And then it happened. In 1978, Paul Newman's son, Scott Newman, died from a drug overdose. One sentence. But it carries the kind of weight that never leaves a family. This wasn't a headline for him. This was not celebrity a tragedy. This was a father standing in front of something no parent is built to survive. A son gone, a future erased, a silence that no amount of money or fame could fill. And the worst part? Loss like that doesn't just hurt, it changes you. People who knew Newman could see it. Something shifted. The light he carried became quieter. The laughter had edges. The joy, even when it appeared, was never the same kind of free. Because when a father loses a child, he doesn't just mourn the child. He mourns himself. He questions every moment, every decision, every time he wasn't there, every time he thought there would be more time later. And Paul Newman, for all his strength, was human. The grief cut deep, but instead of letting that pain turn into bitterness, he did something rare. He turned it into purpose. Out of that heartbreak, he created the Scott Newman Center for Drug Abuse Prevention. It wasn't a public relations move. It was a father trying to build something out of ashes, trying to protect other families from living his nightmare. A foundation meant to educate, prevent, and support. It was his way of saying, if I couldn't save my son, then I will fight to save someone else's. And that decision tells you everything about the kind of man he was. Even in grief, he chose compassion. Even in darkness, he chose action. But don't misunderstand, that doesn't mean he got over it. You don't get over something like this. You learn to carry it. And every time he looked at his other children, every time he walked into his home, every quiet moment when the world wasn't watching, Scott's absence was there, a wound that never fully healed. Yet Newman still tried to hold the family together. He was careful with his work. He often chose roles that wouldn't keep him away too long. And when he had to travel, his family often went with him. Because after losing a Scott, home wasn't just a place, it was everything. And through all of it, Joanne Woodward was there. Not as a woman watching from the sidelines, but as the anchor holding the entire world steady. Still, there was another side of Paul Newman that not everyone saw. A side that didn't live on film sets. A side that ran on speed, risk, and obsession. And it would become one of the biggest tensions inside their marriage. Speed, fear, and the things he never showed the world. Most people thought they knew Paul Newman. They saw the actor, the philanthropist, the loyal husband, the devoted father. But behind that calm, steady image, Paul Newman had another world. A world built on speed, risk, and a hunger for something that Hollywood could never give him. It started in an unexpected way. When he prepared for the 1969 film Winning, Paul Newman didn't want to pretend to be a race car driver. He wanted to become one. So he trained at the Watkins Glen Racing School. And what began as research turned into obsession. By 1979, Newman wasn't dabbling anymore. He was competing for real. And then came the moment that shocked even the people who thought they'd seen everything. he pulled off a stunning second-place finish at the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans, one of the toughest, most brutal endurance races in the world. For Paul, racing wasn't about headlines or fame, it was escape. Hollywood was bright, loud, demanding, a world that wanted to own him, but behind the wheel, he could just be Paul, focused, free, alive, and that's the part people rarely talk about. Sometimes the most perfect people chase danger because it makes them feel real. But while racing gave him freedom, it gave Joanne Woodward something else, fear. Because every time he got on that track, she knew the truth. A mistake at that speed doesn't come with second chances. She worried constantly, not because she wanted to control him, but because she loved him. And loving someone means you feel terror when they walk toward danger smiling. Yet even through that fear, she stood by him. She understood it wasn't just a hobby, it was part of his soul. That kind of understanding is rare. It takes trust deeper than words. And it proved something important about their marriage. Their bond wasn't built on Hollywood fantasy. It was built on acceptance, on loyalty, on standing beside each other even when your heart is shaking. But racing wasn't the only hidden chapter. Paul Newman had other passions he kept quietly in the shadows. He poured time, energy, and money into education, often without press releases, without publicity. One of his biggest contributions was a $10 million endowment to his alma mater, Kenyon College, launching a scholarship fund that opened doors for countless students. No cameras, no applause, just genuine generosity. And then there was another twist. Paul Newman could seriously cook. The world knew his name through salad dressing, sauces, popcorn, lemonade, pet food, but few realized the man himself loved being in the kitchen. Experimenting like cooking was another art form. And even more mysterious, there was talk of secret, unreleased television work. Newman had directed several episodes of a TV adaptation of The Shadow. But those episodes were never released. No real explanation. Just another missing piece in a life already filled with contradictions. And all these layers, racing, education, cooking, hidden projects, painted one clear truth. Paul Newman was never just what the world saw. He was more complex, more private, more human. And through it all, one voice remained the most powerful, Joanne's, because when she finally spoke about him, her words didn't sound like someone talking about a celebrity. They sounded like someone talking about a man she had truly lived beside. Not a myth, not a legend, a husband, a dreamer, a person full of secrets, discipline, and heart. But the most painful chapter was still ahead, because the final battle of his life was not on a racetrack, not in Hollywood, not in politics. It was inside his own body, and Joanne was there for every terrifying step. Lung cancer and the quiet courage no one saw. By 2008, Paul Newman had already lived several lifetimes: actor, racing driver, businessman, activist, father, husband. To the public, he looked like a man who had conquered the world. But that year, the fight became different. This wasn't a battle for a role, not a competition on a track, not a negotiation with studios. This was a fight for life itself. Paul Newman was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2008. And suddenly, the same man who once walked onto sets like he owned the air was facing something that could not be outworked. This illness didn't care about his fame. It didn't care about his legacy. It didn't care that he was Paul Newman. It just took what it wanted. And this is where Joanne Woodward's role became something far deeper than wife. She became his rock, not as a public figure, not as an actress, but as the person who stayed when the world went quiet. In the final year, as he battled his illness, she was there, steady, loving, strong. She wasn't just watching him fade, she was holding him through it. And the real power of their love story wasn't found in red carpets or movie scenes. It was found in those private moments, the moments where fear sits in the room like a shadow, where every small breath matters, where every day feels like borrowed time. Newman faced the diagnosis with the same courage that carried him through his whole life, from serving in the Pacific during World War II to weathering Hollywood's unpredictable highs and lows. But this fight was personal in a way nothing else had ever been, because it wasn't about fame, it was about dignity. And according to Joanne, his spirit stayed unshaken. He fought till the end, and even in those final days, he tried to protect the people he loved from drowning in grief. One of the moments she shared still hits like a punch to the chest. Even while he was sick, he would tell her, "Joanne, we've had a good run. Let's not make this a sad affair." Think about that. A man staring down the end and still trying to keep the people around him from breaking. That wasn't denial, that was love. That was a man who didn't want his goodbye to poison the lives still moving forward. And here's what made it even more haunting. Even as cancer tightened its grip, Paul Newman didn't stop caring about others. While undergoing treatment, he stayed deeply involved in the Newman's own foundation, the charity mission he helped build from the ground up. The organization was famous for donating every cent of its post-tax profits to those in need. Philanthropy wasn't just something he did, it was who he was. Right up to his final days, he poured energy into helping others, as if compassion had no off switch. And Joanne wasn't just standing beside him emotionally, she stepped up even more during those years, taking a hands-on role in managing the foundation's work. Her mission was clear: make sure Paul's vision didn't die with him. Make sure kindness didn't end at his funeral. Make sure what they built together kept growing. Then on September 26, 2008, Paul Newman passed away. The world mourned a legend, but Joanne lost her husband, her best friend, her partner of half a century. She didn't just lose an icon, she lost the person who had been woven into every chapter of her life. Yet even in heartbreak, she didn't retreat. Instead, she kept moving forward, carrying the torch, guarding the legacy, keeping the mission alive. But here's where it gets even more intense, because after he was gone, the world didn't stop asking questions. And the longer she stayed silent, the louder the curiosity became, until finally, years later, Joanne Woodward spoke. And when she did, she didn't speak like someone describing a superstar. She spoke like someone revealing the truth, the kind of truth that changes how you see everything. The truth about loving a legend. For years after Paul Newman died, the world kept talking. His films were replayed. His name stayed polished like a monument. The myth only grew bigger, but Joanne Woodward stayed quiet. 15 years of silence can feel like an ocean, and in that silence, people filled in the blanks with whatever they wanted. Some romanticized him, some questioned him, some turned him into something too perfect to be real. And then, finally, Joanne spoke. In a rare Vanity Fair interview in 2013, she laid out the real math of loving Paul Newman. Not the glamorous version, the real version, the pressure, the pride, the emotional grind, because loving someone the world worships isn't a fairy tale. It's heavy. It means sharing your life with crowds you never invited. It means watching strangers feel entitled to your private pain. It means the world acting like they know a man when they've never seen him in the quiet. And Joanne made something crystal clear. Paul Newman never liked being put on a pedestal. He didn't want to be worshipped. He once said, "If you don't have enemies, you don't have character." That wasn't arrogance. That was humility with backbone. A man who understood that being real means some people won't like you. She also spoke about his racing passion, the one that terrified her for years. People always pressed her about the danger, but she didn't paint him as reckless. She painted him as meticulous, locked in, never sloppy. She said he handled the track the same way he handled a role. All in, no shortcuts, maximum respect for the craft. And then she went deeper into the final days. This is the part that hits hardest, because when she spoke about the end, she didn't describe a broken man. She described a fighter, a man who stayed calm even when his body was failing. And in the middle of that nightmare, he said something that is still stings and soothes at the same time. "Joanne, we've had a good run. Let's not make this a sad affair." Listen to how haunting that is, a man facing death and is still trying to protect the woman he loved from drowning in sorrow. Joanne also underscored something that mattered more to him than applause: the mission, the giving, the work he built with Newman's own. She made it clear that even as his health faded, the philanthropy didn't stop. Because for Paul Newman, impact mattered more than fame. And then came one of the most heartbreaking confessions of all, something she recalled him saying that revealed what he feared most about his legacy. "If all people remember me for is salad dressing, then I failed." That line says everything. It shows a man who didn't want shallow praise, didn't want a simple label, didn't want his life reduced to a product, because Paul Newman wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to matter. And Joanne, after he was gone, felt it was her responsibility to carry what they started. She said they always believed in giving back. And after his passing, she felt she had to continue that mission, not for the public, for him, for what they built together. And then, with a softness that made everything feel painfully human, she revealed the truth about their bond, not as a headline, not as Hollywood gossip, but as a simple, intimate truth. "We were soulmates in every sense of the word," she said. And I think that's the greatest legacy anyone can ask for. In that moment, the myth cracked open, because suddenly Paul Newman wasn't just a legend. He was a husband who loved fiercely, a father who carried grief, a man who fought until the end, a human being who wanted to be remembered not for fame, but for the good he left behind. And that's why Joanne Woodward finally speaking matters so much. Because through her honesty, we don't just see the star, we see the man. What Joanne's silence really protected. When Paul Newman died on September 26, 2008, the world didn't just lose a star. Hollywood lost a standard, a kind of man the industry rarely produces anymore. A man who carried fame without letting it rot his soul. A man who could have chased worship, but instead chose purpose. For the public, his death was a moment of reflection. For Joanne Woodward, it was something else entirely. It was the moment her life split into two parts, before him and after him, because she didn't just lose a famous husband. She lost her best friend, her partner, her home, and that's why her silence mattered. People thought she stayed quiet because she was fragile, But maybe she stayed quiet because what she carried was too heavy to place in the hands of strangers. Because when you love someone for 50 years, you don't speak about them like a headline. You speak about them like a wound you still protect. And for 15 years, the world kept demanding answers. They wanted stories, secrets, drama, a twist big enough to reshape a legend. But what Joanne finally revealed wasn't scandal. It was something far more heartbreaking. It was truth. A truth that didn't decorate Paul Newman's life. It exposed the real cost of it. She reminded people that behind the famous face was a man with discipline and humility. A man who didn't want to be put on a pedestal. A man who believed character came with enemies. A man who faced lung cancer without turning his final chapter into a spectacle. And most of all, a man who feared being misunderstood, because nothing is more tragic than living a life of meaning and being remembered for something shallow. That's why his words cut so deep. If all people remember me for is salad dressing, then I failed. It wasn't bitterness. It was a cry from someone who wanted to be seen clearly, not as a product, not as a face, not as a brand, but as a person who tried in his own way to leave the world better than he found it. And when you look at what he built, you understand why. He co-founded Newman's Own in 1982, a brand that broke the rules by donating every single post-tax dollar of profit to charity. What began as a playful experiment, mixing salad dressing in a bathtub with friends, turned into a global mission. By 2020, Newman's Own had donated over $550 million to charities around the world. He co-founded the Hole in the Wall Gang Camp in 1988, a summer camp in Ashford, Connecticut, giving children with serious illnesses something priceless, joy, freedom, laughter, completely free. And after losing his son Scott to a drug overdose in 1978, he turned grief into action by founding the Scott Newman Center for Drug Abuse Prevention. That's who he was. Not a man who ran from pain, a man who converted pain into purpose. And that's why Joanne's role became so powerful after his death. She didn't just mourn him, she protected what he stood for. She stepped up. She carried their shared mission. She made sure the compassion didn't end when the funeral ended, because love doesn't disappear when someone dies. Sometimes love becomes responsibility. And that's the real tragedy Joanne Woodward finally opened up about. Not the illness alone, not the fame, not even the headlines. The tragedy was that even the greatest lives still end, and the people left behind must learn how to breathe without them. Yet, through her courage, she gave the world something rare, not gossip, not scandal, a human portrait, a reminder that greatness isn't measured by trophies. It's measured by what you leave behind in other people's lives. And Paul Newman's legacy lives on in every child who laughs at those camps, in every family helped through addiction education, in every charity that received hope instead of leftovers, and in every person who looks at his story and realizes a real legend isn't the one who is most famous, it's the one who used fame to do good. If this story moved you, don't just watch and leave. Like the video, subscribe. Share it with someone who still believes in old school Hollywood greatness. And drop a comment below. What do you think is Paul Newman's true legacy? Because the more we talk about these stories, the more they stay alive.